This is a response to the text in the description of the video Why Lack of Belief Has the Burden of Proof Explained by Steve McRae. I'm looking at one of the two syllogisms offered. I'll do the second syllogism at a later time. Okay, the first argument is as follows. Premise 1. All beliefs to be rational, excluding properly basic, depending on who you ask, require justification to be rational. Premise 2. If you believe you are not justified to assign a truth value to the proposition of theism, theism is true or theism is false, then that belief also requires a justification. And then conclusion, since that justification is not a belief about the actual proposition itself, it is a second order justification. Okay, so first premise, all beliefs to be rational, excluding properly basic, depending on who you ask, require justification to be rational. So, okay, what's the excluding properly basic, depending on who you ask bit? I would think that this is referring to a priori beliefs, like reality is real, minds exist other than my own, and that this is not just some dream or hallucination or, we're in the Matrix or something like that. There are many, many, many a priori beliefs that we have and that we kind of have to have in a sense, in a philosophical sense, in order to move forward. Sure, we can question reality, but it doesn't really lead anywhere. It's just a, well, it could be sort of scenario, and it's not really any evidence that it is that. It's just it could be. So, in order for your belief, whatever that belief is, to be rational, there must be justification for that belief. And this also, I would think, would depend upon who you ask, because everybody's going to have different views on it. But it shouldn't rely upon who you ask at all. I see that as irrelevant. Who you ask, who cares? I don't care what anybody says. Either this proposition, this premise, is either true or false. Either this is valid and sound, or it's not. So, all beliefs to be rational require justification to be rational. That, in and of itself, is an isolated premise, an isolated statement that may or may not be correct. Well, let's break it down. So, the statement itself is a statement of either belief or a statement of fact. So in order for it to be rational, it requires justification for the statement. So what's the justification for the statement being rational? Well, if it's irrational, then who cares? And if it's rational, then, well, it matters. And it's kind of a simple sort of formula. If you're going to say, well, who cares about rationality, then everything's out the window and you might as well believe anything, and, the vice versa. So this seems rather straightforward, doesn't seem to have any problems with it. All beliefs should have a justification to show that they're rational. But, well, what do we mean by rational? That could be ferreted out more by a longer explanation of these words, but we're going to assume that rational means, coherent and understandable to some degree. It's not saying that the belief is true, it's just saying that it's rational to hold the belief. So because of X, Y, and Z, that's why I believe that this is true. Or because of A, B, and C, I don't believe that this is true. Although here the statement is saying beliefs. It's not saying non-beliefs. So will that present a problem later in the argument? Let's find out. Okay, so if you believe you are not justified to assign a truth value to the proposition of theism is true or theism false, then that belief also requires a justification. So this is set up as a hypothetical. How do we know that? Because the word if is there. Now, the first premise didn't contain if, but that's possibly an okay thing. It kind of makes it a little bit of a weird hypothetical syllogism, but we'll give it a pass for now. So if you believe you're not justified to assign a truth value to this particular proposition, then that belief also has to have a justification for it. So whatever the proposition might be, whether it's theism or some other thing, you would also additionally have to justify that belief, because it's a belief. It's not something to do with reality or necessarily. It's not, it's not something that you're saying is true or false. It's something that you believe is correct. So what would your justification be to say that you are not justified in assigning a truth value to X? And that would require some other argument for you to make, if this is indeed true. Then we have a second part of this that is talking about the thing that we're referencing, in this case, theism. And then the statement true or false is in regards to theism. Okay, is there a false dichotomy or an excluded middle potentially there? Possibly so. But it might not be as relevant as you think it might be, because we are assuming, tentatively granting, if you will, that within this, we're having to prove whether or not the proposition that I have to assign a truth value is itself something that I now have to give a justification for. So whether there's an additional fallacy or any fallacy at all committed in the definition of what theism is might not really matter. Although it kind of hurts the argument, we're going to maybe ignore it because we want to give the principle of charity and steelman this argument. I mean, yeah, it's not really exactly true that theism is true or theism is false. Like, depends what you mean by that, and there's a lot of issues with that. But yeah, it doesn't matter. What matters is X. We could have said X instead of theism, and it would have been fine. So if you believe that you're not justified in assigning a truth value to the proposition of X, then that would also require justification due to P1. And then the conclusion follows that the justification regarding P2 is not about the belief of the actual proposition, then it's a secondary order justification. What? Yes, we'll just say yes to this. I think that this could be rephrased in a better way, but I mean, I get what it's trying to say. So we're talking about P2, and we're not talking about whether or not the thing that I'm referring to is necessarily true or false. We're talking about justifying the idea that I believe that I can't assign a truth value in the first place. That's all. And therefore, that's a second order justification. Okay. It might be a second order justification. What does that have to... Why does that matter? What is that? What do you mean by that? Okay. So, does that follow from P1 or P2? No. It doesn't. Oops. That's okay, though, because we're just going to ignore that. Because we... Just ignore it. Just ignore that. It doesn't follow. Just because I said to ignore it. That's why. That's why. Because I don't want to be accused of straw manning this. After all, I mean, just because the conclusion is like, huh? It's like, so what? What do you mean by that? What? Huh? I'm sure it's in the video. I didn't watch the video. I'm only looking at the text. Yeah, because the argument, should stand or fail on its own. Yeah, but this doesn't follow, but we'll ignore that. I guess. Okay, so all beliefs to be rational have to have a justification. And then if you have a belief regarding whether or not you can assign a truth value to the proposition of X, then you have to justify it. Actually, that would have been fine by itself. Those two things, that would have been the end of it. But then the conclusion is that the justification in regards to the second order justification is then let's just ignore the last one. Let's just get rid of the third of one there, because I think that's gonna just give us problems. So let's just stick with those first two. Okay, yeah, I don't see a problem with this in and of itself. But what if it's not a belief? What if it is true that you are not justified to assign a truth value to the proposition X? What if it's more than a belief? What if this is the way things work? The way, let's say, logic functions. That there's a rule in logic that says you have to do X, Y, and Z. So your belief is that logic is valid and sound and coherent and makes sense and is usable. Do I now need to justify the belief that I have in logic? How far does that rabbit hole go? Or would that be considered a basic belief that I don't necessarily have to justify? In fact, what would the basic beliefs be? Because they're immune to this idea of justification. Who decides what a basic belief is? And what's the criteria for it being a basic belief? Well, those are interesting problems that I don't have any solution to. So let's just ignore all those problems, I guess. So I'm not willing to infinitely loop this by saying, well, this is a belief and you have to justify the justification of the belief. I think that if you ask for this to be coherent within itself, then you have to tentatively grant that it's true in order to ask for the justification in the first place. So let's get that out of the way. So we have two words that are very important for this premise: rational and justification. What would it mean for something to be considered rational? Well, the opposite of irrational. So it doesn't say whether the belief is correct or real or true, but it says, yeah, okay, you are rational in holding that. This is essentially William Lane Craig has set out to do this by saying reasonable faith and making the arguments that he does make. And he's trying to use these different arguments all combined into one larger argument to say you're reasonable to have faith, and here's the justification for that, these various arguments. What is not stated within this premise is whether or not the justification must also be rational. But I think that we can infer that. I think we can assume that that's the case. But, well, rather than assuming, maybe we would want to rewrite this so that it's included in there, so that the reader of this can't say, well, I've listed a justification, and the justification, although rational, is still justification, and therefore my belief is rational. So this I recognize as needing some repair done on the first premise at some level to sharpen it to be a better premise. If that first one was fixed, then I think the second one would still stand, but you might have to edit it a little bit to more align with the first one. And I'm just going to leave the third one out of it. I can't fix that one. at all. I can't. It's broken. I don't know what to do with it. Okay, I'll look at it anyways. Honestly, I don't know what second order justification is just by the argument presented. Now, yes, you could look that up and see what it is or see what it possibly is, but an argument should ideally stand or fall on its own merits and shouldn't need the person that's viewing the argument to do additional research to figure out what the bleep you mean by what you're saying. That second order bit isn't connected to premise 1 or 2 in any way that is tangible. There's nothing that mentions second order justification in premise 1 or 2. So that's about all I can say on this. Is it simply isn't connected, and I would just discard this. Here's my proposed fix for this particular syllogism. All beliefs to be rational must offer rational justification. You believe you are not justified to assign a truth value to X, therefore you must give a rational justification for that belief. Valid, sound, coherent, everything connects together, and we're leaving X to be nebulous because it doesn't really necessarily matter what X is. Although it might matter in the broader sense of a larger argument taking place, it fixes this syllogism. Now, before you get to that syllogism, or after you present that syllogism, you're going to want to maybe define what you mean by belief and rational justification and things like this, but nonetheless, at least it doesn't have the problems that I alluded to with the first version of this argument. And by allude to, I meant the parts where I said, well, here's a possible problem that we're going to ignore, and I was being kind of humorous. So, yeah, those problems. But this one isn't necessarily perfect either. It could still use some work. I'll leave that up to you. Why? Because, I don't know. I want to give you something to do. All right. Alright, that's all I've got for now. The purpose of this was not to agree or disagree with the conclusion of the argument, but merely point out the logical fallacies of that argument or potential fallacies and problems with it, to offer a potential solution for the phrasing of the argument that could potentially still work. And that's it. That's the entire purpose of this analysis, directed solely at the text. The larger argument is being ignored for the purpose of analyzing in isolation this particular syllogism. So if you have an objection about anything that I've said here, that's great. Show me the logical error that I've made and how I made it, and I'll respond to that as I can. And that's it. That's all I got. Hopefully this will help someone somewhere make the argument somewhat better, maybe, unless they ignore it. I guess that's also possible. And I don't have a good way to end this video, so here's a blooper. So, as I kind of referenced before, this statement is a sneeze.